Today, I would like to present my paper on 6th ILSAS International Conference on Learning and Development 2022 with title Education Impact on Economic Growth. It is Myth or Fact by Muhammad Irsyad Rusdin from PT Pembangkitan Jawa Bali. World development has had several important global issues over decades, including the economy and education. Education system is an important foundation in development of every nation because it determines human capital quality and welfare. Education is the main tool to prepare individuals to compete professionally both at home and abroad, adapt to their environment, and also basic foundation to become good citizens. According to Global Competitiveness Report 2020, the capabilities and skills of individuals and populations are key drivers of economic prosperity and productivity by ensuring the individuals can maintain good health, abilities to fulfill their needs. It is developed through education over 2 decades of an individual's life. One of the references to measure the quality of education across country is PISA. PISA is Program for International Student Assessment, which program measures student achievement for 15-year students in 3 areas: mathematics, science, and literacy. Lack of science and reading competency in Indonesia are one of the factors why the education in Indonesia is still at low level. Minister of Education and Culture, Mendikbud of Indonesia, Nadiem Anwar Makarim, said that result of the 2018 program for PISA were a good perspective for advancing the quality of education in Indonesia. Through a different perspective, Indonesia is invited to see how other countries see the education system in Indonesia, as well as provide objective input or improvements that need to be made in the future. These articles try to differ and answer the contradiction. The prior research of that GDP differs significantly according to the achievement on PISA's test differ unrelated to GDP. It is different with another finding that the significance of educational skills for GDP growth, which might be treated as a confirmation of the importance of quality primary and secondary education for economic development. The analysis of economic outcomes and quality of education is measured by results. In this case, cognitive tests become relevant to describe the quality of education. PISA scores are an indicators of educational attainment. In recent study, a country with high cognitive ability level, as well as cognitively competent and well-paid teachers, are likely to perform better in large-scale international assessment. The country that want increased level of per capita output and labor productivity can increase the capacity of their citizens. The relationship between the health of the country's citizens and the quality of their education can be seen as a preliminary study to identify the factors associated with PISA scores. Many of studies have discussed about relation between education quality on economic growth. PISA science score improvements relates increasing efficiency in public spending education to improvement in annual GDP per capita. The result indicate that if the country manage and eliminate any inefficiency in spending with a view at achieving high PISA score, the growth of GDP per capita would be increased in the long run. The human capital is the most significant factor related to current patent application per capita and current GDP per capita. Literacy is highly significant in all-purpose specification. Several studies suggest that there is a relationship between whether education has a direct or indirect effect on improving the quality of life of citizens, including the economy. Research shows that a higher education develops the effect of absolute size of years education on labor market outcome is not different, but the effect of position size is different. Primary schooling should also be given in priority because primary education serves as an input for all higher level of education. Since the role of labor force seems to be very important in understanding the relationship between education and economic growth, so it is suggested that labor force should be given more chance to enhance their skill. The variable labor force must be included while examining the causality between education and economic growth. It is also recommended that the nexus between education and economic growth with inclusion of their variables other than physical capital and labor force should further be tested and generalized. Education and training with strong externally has a positive external effect on socio-economic development, which can be reflected in many aspects, such as improving the labor quality to promote economic efficiency, training and upgrading labor skill to speed industrial upgrading, increase labor income to narrow urban-rural income gap, changing the Chinese prices to enhance product competitiveness, promoting social employment to develop social and social harmony, better meeting people's materials and cultures, and accelerating green economic development. As a result, the development of education and training industry play a significant role in improving labor quality, expanding social employment, changing the economic development mode, adjusting and optimizing the industrial structures, and finally promoting the harmonious development of the economy and society. Contrary in Saudi, economic growth shows in adapt on a role of investment in tertiary education. To test the causality between investment in higher education and economic growth, the results were decisive in an absence of causality to invest in higher economic growth. In addition, the trend of causality was in terms of economic growth toward investment in tertiary education. In other words, spending on higher education in Saudi Arabia is based on economic growth and investment for higher education to be one of the causes growth as in developed country. In conclusion, the study result didn't support the relationship between investment in higher education and economic growth. On contrary, it is recommended that government should focus more higher education, particularly to university education. More funds should be allocated to education in line with the other sectors, particularly to university and higher education level, so that the economic growth can be further accelerated. This will in turn lead to the further education and hence development. Poor should be facilitated to get higher education so that polarization in higher education may further to be minimized. What about the relation with public expenditure and GDP per capita? In this study, variables called expenditures on education based on prior research at 2020. The decision to increase the education spending has a positive effect on quality of education in country, however, economic conditions. This support the view that expenditures or budgets for education and creative activity should be not limited. The existence of stable and strong long-run relationship among these variables strong evidence bidirectional causality is running from education expenditure to GDP and vice versa. And education expenditure are helping the GDP of Bangladesh to grow, where GDP also influence the education expenditures. The European countries are in line with those obtained by other studies in the field. For six Eastern Europe states, Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, and Latvia, the study discovered long-term interconditioning relationship between education spending and GDP, with result on short-term positive or negative. For other 5 countries, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, there is no long-term relationship and there's no B co-integration between the analyzed variables. For the method, we use regression analysis. Why we use regression analysis? Regression analysis is one of the most frequently used analysis techniques in market research. It allows market researchers to analyze the relationship between dependent variables and independent variables. The key benefit of using regression analysis is it allows us to first calculate if one independent variables or a set of independent variables has a significant relationship with a dependent variable. And the second is estimate the relative strengths of different independent variables effect on dependent variables. And the third is make prediction. Knowing what the effect of independent variables on dependent variables are help market research in many different ways to identify the impact of variation in education, public expenditure on GDP per capita. Both dependent and dependent variables are in logarithmic form. The equation shows below. Look at the equation below. We using logarithmic form to regress GDP per capita as dependent variables and education expenditure and education or PISA score in independent variables. Log GDP is logarithm of gross domestic product per capita in country E in year T. Log edu is logarithm of education of country I in year T. Log PE is a logarithm of public expenditures of country I in year T, whereas alpha is a constant value. Now we move to the results. For this table, we show descriptive statistic for GDP per capita, PISA score, and public expenditures on education. Table 1 presents descriptive statistic of 3 variables. They are GDP per capita in US dollar, PISA score in unit points, public expenditures in million US dollar. For the value on the GDP per capita average on 44,172.59, whereas minimum is 14,314. For the maximum is 115,046. There were 100,735 gap between maximum and minimum of GDP per capita. It was indicate large gap of on income among OECD countries. On PISA score, average on 481.36, whereas minimum 400.3 and the maximum 525.3. There were 125 points of gap. on public expenditure average on 1,408.43, whereas minimum 436.43 and maximum 3,147.74. In order to estimate the economic model, we perform the necessary testing using SPSS software to identify the characteristic of the data and to consider the best fitting model. With F-test and T-test where possible to identify that a cross-sections model is preferable over an ordinary least square model. Take a look at the variables in table 2. In GDP per capita, education or PISA score, expenditure on education. From the result of processing using statistical software, both F-test and T-test were obtained. The p-value is less than alpha or p-value less than 0.001, so there was significant impact among variables. R-square can be interpreted as a value that measures the proportion or total variation around the mean value of y that can be explained by regression model. R-square value range from 0 to with 1, and result appears that the value R-square is 0.880. We multiply the value of R-square by a number of correspondent or sample as many as 37, and the result is 37 times 0.178, result 6.586 with 1% significant. Smaller than chi-square, 6.635, suggested that no indicating heteroskedasticity among variables and model is preferable. We move to the discussion. The aim of our study to examine education was proxied by PISA score. Public education on education have a statistically significant impact on GDP per capita performance. Multivariate linear regression applied to the data from 37 countries were statistically significant, which have coefficients 0.287 for education variables and 0.738 for public expenditures on education. It was indicated every 1 unit point education increased 0.287 growth of GDP per capita, and every 1 unit point of public expenditure increased 0.1738 growth of GDP per capita. In the case of education, a similar result was reported in several previous studies. The result Kazi et al. 2018 revealed that higher educations reduce the income equality. However, the attainment of education is highly dependent on availability of resources. The education level can be improved by investing more percentage of GDP in education sectors. The educational investment increased the education expansion. Because of this educational expansion, the human capital skill improved, and as a result, the income equality reduced. The government should make access to education easier and should try to reduce inequality in education. There should be a pathway between the educational sectors and the employment so that employers should recruit the potential employees. More spending on educational institutions would improve the poor conditions of the school and college. Those who cannot afford a higher education to be made accessible on basis of merit. Policies aiming to supply subsidies to those who cannot afford education should be provided. Moreover, private institutions usually fail to provide such facilities to poor income groups, which is likely the rationale as to why Adam Smith concentrated on the public allocation of education. Education, on the other hand, is a fundamental right and merit-based. Therefore, government needs to realize the importance of this segment in increased spending on education. In the case of education, a similar result was reported in several previous studies. Plavan 2020 mentioned the decision to increase education spending has a positively effect on the quality of education in the country, which is related with economic conditions. This is in the line with the finding education has a positive external effect and can comprehensively improve the quality of labor force and human resources, which is an important driving force to improve economic efficiency and overall national strength. The limitation of the study rests mainly in the fact that data were not available for all OECD countries, including Indonesia, that participated in PISA 2018 study. Because we just pick up the country which is provide 3 variables available. Now we move to the conclusions. This paper has empirically examined how the education is reflected by PISA score. Public education on education has impacted economic growth. By analyzing of a group 37 countries from OECD. Economic growth is measured by GDP per capita. Having utilized the ILSAS, our results indicate that in the country with better access to the education, more positive to economic growth. These results also suggest that more we spend money for education, increase self-capability and impact to their income. It is concluded that, firstly, PISA score reflected people's ability. It is concluded that, firstly, PISA score reflected people's ability to do their job well and positively contribute to economic growth. Secondly, more the country allocated their budget to education, the impact is positively to economic growth. There was a final presentation of my paper, and finally, I would like to say thanks to PT Pembangkitan Jawa Bali or PT PLN Nusantara Power with moral and material support for this paper. Special thanks to Bapak Mariono as a General Manager and other management team PT Pembangkitan Jawa Bali Unit Pembangkitan Muara Karang. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.